Hello and welcome to my middle game series, Mastering the Basics. On today's video, we're gonna cover one of the most important things in chess, and that is the strategy of pawn structures, and more specifically, the strategy of how to use files correctly. The first thing that we need to learn when we're looking at files on any position is to recognize which types of files are we talking about, which types of file are we looking at from our perspective when we're playing white or black, and also from our opponent's perspective. This is a concept that can get a little bit confusing, but it's actually a very basic and very simple concept that will make you a much better player right away. So without further ado, let's actually get into this very basic, very simple position. There are basically almost no pieces on it, but it has all types of different files. Now, we're going to start with the easiest one to learn, which is the closed file. So what is a closed file? Well, a closed file is basically a file that has a pawn of your pawn structure in your pawn structure. So if you have a white pawn, in this case, I'm looking at it from white perspective, and I have a pawn on a file, that means that file is closed for me. It doesn't mean that it has to be closed for my opponent because, well, it depends if he has a pawn on it as well. But if I'm looking from white perspective, we're going to start from white perspective. How many closed files do I have in this position? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I have 6 pawns, so I have 6 closed files. Now, why is that important? Well, because closed files tell you where not to put your pieces. The only time that, but more specifically, sorry, the rooks. The other thing is that sometimes you might have to be passive and put a rook on a closed file. But it's okay as long as you know that eventually you're going to have to be active, become more active, and you have to move that rook to a more active position. Now, what are those more active files? Well, not closed files, so let's start with that. It's going to have to be an open file, or it's going to have to be a semi-open file. Now, what is an open file? So an open file is a file that has no pawns at all. No pawns of mine, no pawns of my opponents. And again, in this case, there's only one open file in this position, and that will be the E file. Now, open files are everybody tells you to always get on the open files. Your rooks should always be on open files, but it's not always the case. Sometimes open files are not as good as semi-open files, and that's the next one in line. So we talked about closed files. Now you know what an open file is. Now we're going to talk about semi-open files. So what is a semi-open file? A semi-open file is a file that has none of your pawns, but it has a pawn of your opponent. All right, so let's try to figure out which one will be an open file. So I'm looking for a file that has none of my pawns. Well, I only have 2 right now that has none of my pawns. But I'm also looking for the file that has 1 pawn from my opponent, and that is the C file. So if you're looking for a semi-open file in this position, the file, and the only one that we have right now, is the C file. Okay? Now, the most important thing about open files and semi-open files and closed files is the perspective of where you're looking at the position. If you're playing white, your perspective of things is different from black. For example, if we go back to the concept of the closed files, well, for black, the same files that are closed for white are not closed for black because black has different pawns. We have different pawn structure in this case. Yes, we have 3 files that are the same, actually 4, because we have this. All these 4 files are closed for black. Black has the C file that is closed, but actually the D file that's closed for white is not closed for black. So this is where the confusion sometimes gets, and especially for lower rated players that don't understand the concept very well. But these files are gonna tell you where to put your pieces. You, especially the rooks, the queens, and where to put pressure on a weak pawn. It will change and it will tell you what is considered a weak pawn in any position, or at least a pawn that's a real target in a certain position. In this one, if I'm looking at it from white perspective, we're going to start again from white perspective, and I'm looking for weaknesses. Well, usually the weaknesses are set on the semi-open files. So an open file by itself, like this one, does not give you a guarantee of a target, because the only reason you will get onto an open file will be if you actually go in and attack a pawn. So the activity of your pieces, especially your rooks, is measured by what are they doing, what are they attacking, and especially attacking pawns. So I could go here and I could go here. That would be a great plan to put on the rook on the 7th rank, because then I can target the C pawn, maybe the A pawn and possibly also the F pawn. So I can target a lot of pawns, right? But that would take a while, and the pawn is not guaranteed to stay where it is. But now here, a more shorter way to put pressure on that pawn would be to double the rooks on the semi-open file. And why am I doing this? Well, because I know that there is a weak pawn, in this case, isolated pawn on the C file. This is a very basic concept, but a lot of the time we forget to put pressure on the weaknesses. So once you learn this concept, the first thing you need to do is learn this very well. You need to learn what is an open file, what is a closed file, what is a semi-open file. Once you know that, then you know that rooks should not be on the closed file, and rooks should be on semi-open files, rooks should be on open files. Now, the big question about all of this is, when should you use the open files and when should you use a semi-open file? When are semi-open files good and when are they bad? Well, that's going to be our next concept here. And we talked about open files, we talked about closed files and semi-open files. But what is a good semi-open file and what is a bad semi-open file? Once again, this depends on the perspective of where you're looking for. So we've talked about this semi-open file already. We have not talked about black's semi-open files, right? So when I look at this semi-open file for white, I can tell you, and you can see that this will be considered a good semi-open file. Now, what makes this semi-open file a good semi-open file is that there is no pawn protecting this pawn that's weak. All right? So if a pawn is protected by another pawn, or could potentially be protected by another pawn, then that would not be considered a good file, or sorry, a good semi-open file, or at least it wouldn't be considered a long-term good semi-open file, because black can protect that pawn. Now, in this case, black has no other pawn near that pawn. Well, it is an isolated pawn, which makes it extremely weak. And that's why I know I can target this pawn safely and I will get results out of it, because there's no pawn that can protect that pawn. Now, we don't have any other semi-open files, so we cannot talk about more semi-open files if we're looking for white. But when we're looking for black now, you're going to see a completely different perspective where all the files are now changing. We have two different semi-open files, as you can see. We have two, one on the D file and another one on the B file. One of them is actually a good semi-open file, and one of them is not so good, or at least is going to be, at some point, is going to be bad. Can you guys tell me which one is the bad one? Well, you can look by seeing which pawns are possibly protected by other pawns. So when I look at the D file, I'm noticing that, well, this is an isolated pawn as well. That pawn cannot be protected by any of the other pawns because there are no pawns surrounding that pawn. So that will be a permanent weak pawn for white for a long time. And so what about the B file? Well, the B file is different, because if I put a rook on the BA file, right, and I try to target that pawn, what's going to happen is that white will actually make a move like B3, and you will make that semi-open file a bad semi-open file. So this, again, notice that I'm repeating myself a lot of the time. It's almost the same concept, but they're changing a little bit, right? The file, or the semi-open file that was good for us for one moment, it became bad because I placed my pawn in a position where it is protected by another pawn that is not on a semi-open file, because this file is what? This file is closed. So the reality of me targeting this pawn is basically almost impossible, or at least not in a very easy way that would be easy for me to coordinate and to get there, especially now if I have to attack with both rooks. So this is not considered a weakness, even though it is a pawn, it is the base of the pawn structure. It is not considered a weakness because it's not on a semi-open file, so I cannot attack it because this pawn is there. Now, if this pawn was somewhere else, and it was somewhere else here, then what would I do? I would switch my rook and I would put it on the file that has the base of the pawn structure, or that has the pawn that's not protected by another pawn. So that little concept of semi-open file is the hardest one to understand from all of these files concepts. Everybody knows what an open file, everybody knows what a closed file is. But sometimes we look at semi-open files and we're not paying attention to what is a good or a bad semi-open file. And that is so big to understand, to not waste time attacking weaknesses. So why am I bringing this up? Well, because if I'm playing black here, I know one thing. Obviously, I have to protect this pawn. That we'll talk about that, but that's just more tactical. I'm talking about when I have to make the decision about which pawn to attack. If I have multiple files, I have an open file, I have two semi-open files, I know that my only realistic target here will be the pawn that's not protected by another pawn. So what would I do? I will choose the semi-open file that has that pawn. I would not waste my time going here and then trying to target a pawn that will be protected in one move, and it will be impossible for me to take, right? Now, if I didn't have anything else, I would obviously do this anyway, but I do have something else. So in this position, probably the best move, because, well, we're gonna talk about rook activity in another lesson, but this will be the best move because I don't even want to be passive protecting this pawn. I'll be okay to do this and try to become more active. But this is out of the scope of this video. My point is that when choosing where to put your rooks, you have to consider these open files and semi-open files. It's extremely important for you. Now that we understand what an open file, semi-open file, and closed files are, we're gonna move on to an actual real example of one of my students that I thought was very interesting, and is basically this position. So in this position, white just took the bishop. There was a bishop takes 9 here, queen takes f3, and we're out of the opening, which a lot of the time you can get very quickly and very safely. And now we have to start improving our position. And I'm playing black here. So if you're playing black here, my first question to you will be, what would you do if you had to make a move here? And very quickly, if we looked at the concept of semi-open files, open files, and closed files, we know certain things already based on the pawn structure. And one of them that's extremely simple is that we have 7 pawns, right? Now we know that whatever those pawns are, we should not have our rooks, right? So I don't want my rook to be here. I don't want my rooks to be there, unless I'm opening this later. I definitely don't want that rook there. Now this rook, on the other hand, is actually in great shape because it's actually on a semi-open file. It is targeting a pawn that right now it is actually a weak pawn because it's not protected by this pawn. Yeah, it could be protected eventually, but it's not happening yet. The queen is there. You have to move it away. So when I look at this position, my first thing is that, okay, I have a real target on the E file, right? That's a semi-open file. I also have another semi-open file, the B file. So if my rook could somehow teleport and be here, that would be incredible, because I know for a fact that this will be the bigger chance that I have to actually win something in this position, to win a pawn in this position. But of course, it's not that easy. I have the queen in the way. I have my rook that have to be moved, and then I can bring this other one. It might take a little bit. So you can find other ways to do that. Now, there's a very beautiful plan here that my student didn't do, but they played d5 here, which is it's an equalizing move. It's not bad. But based on this idea, all I need to do is put pressure on the weak pawn. In this case, is the E pawn. So black can actually place the rook on the B file, attacking the weak pawn. Now white can make this semi-open file bad for me by making the move b3, very typical on this sort of position. And then now we have this amazing tactic that, or some pressure that we could do with rook b4. Now it doesn't mean this is a good semi-open file or anything. This is more of a tactical move. I also probably need my queen first here to protect this pawn, because I want to be able to maybe stop white from doing this move. But this again is out of the point of this video. What I wanted to show you is how you should use your rooks based on the pawn structure. The moment that white makes this move, this file here becomes a bad semi-open file for black, and so it becomes a waste for you if you want to keep putting pressure on this file. So what do? We switch to the file that is actually real, that is a real target for black. So I mean, yeah, again, queen d7 might be a great move, and then rook e7, and then rook e8. So what I want you to get from these is the fact that you can guide your plan on the middle game based only on the pawn structure. It's not that hard, but sometimes we forget, and we're trying to base all our moves on tactics, and we forget about the basics of chess, which is, where are the weaknesses, where are the real targets? Well, semi-open files, open files, and closed files are definitely all very important concepts that you need to learn so that you can guide yourself into this. Once again, one last one that I wanted to mention very quickly is the idea of the backwards pawn. So this is one of the most common ways of people responding to my favorite line, the Scotch, against the double king pawn. It happens so many times online, and I just want to show you something that people do all the time, and it's creating a backwards pawn or a weak pawn on a semi-open file. So right now, right at the opening, right, every time there's a pawn structure change, a trade of pawns, so a pawn moves away from one file to the other, you have to update your pawn structure understanding of the position. In this case, even here in move 4 or 5, we already can see that we have two semi-open files that were created, one for white and one for black, right? Now, there are many moves here that black can do, but in general, the only pressure that I'm going to have for a little while until more files get open is going to be between the D and the E file, okay? So now here, one of the most common moves here that people do, they like to do it because it's a forcing move, and they play C5 to attack the queen. As you can see, that creates an extremely weak pawn on the D file. And again, there was another pawn change on the pawn structure, and so what do? I update my understanding and the way I use my pieces so that I can target the new weakness. In this case, the new weakness is the D pawn. So why is that? Now, the interesting thing about this move is that it made a semi-open file that eventually black could just simply play D6 and make this semi-open file a bad semi-open file for white, or at least not an easy to attack pawn on the semi-open file, which is why this is a bad semi-open file. It makes it into a good semi-open file, because the moment that you play C5, who is protecting this pawn? What's the future of that pawn? When I make a move like, let's say, Queen D3, or like the one that I'm recommending on the course, Mayhem in the Scotch, Queen E3, you want to play D6, I'm going to play Knight C3. So this is not going to be a very special development. All I have to do is think about how to put pressure on the weak pawn that's on the good semi-open file, because now that pawn is not protected by another pawn. And you know, in general, what I'm gonna do, I know my rooks, at least one of my rooks, if not both, should be on this file. So everything I do from now on will be targeted of thinking about how to target that pawn on D6. So I might put my queen here, I might put my bishop here, I'm castling, I'm putting my rooks there, double the rooks, that pawn is going to fall. Now why? Because I am planning ahead based on the pawn structure. It's like one move. Give me maybe 10 easy moves to follow through so that I can reach the moment where I can finally get that weak pawn, because black made this horrible move in move 5. This is strategy. This is what middle game strategy is about. And as you can see, it's all about files, about open files, semi-open files, and the most important one, the more difficult one, semi-open files. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, guys, and I hope you learned. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will expand on this if needed. But I hope you enjoy this video. Thank you.